In a quiet suburb of Portland, a 58-year-old high school English teacher was about to embark on a journey that would change her life forever. What started as a retirement dream quickly became a battleground of doubt, ridicule, and shattered confidence. Margaret Sullivan wasn't your typical aspiring author. For 30 years, she had nurtured the creative voices of others while keeping her own stories locked away in a drawer. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The rejection letters spread across Margaret's kitchen table. Like fallen autumn leaves. Cream-colored envelopes with various publishing house logos, each containing variations of the same message. While your writing shows promise. Unfortunately, your manuscript doesn't quite fit our current catalog. We wish you success in placing your work elsewhere. Each one a reminder of dreams deferred and chances not taken. The most recent rejection, her 27th, lay on top, its corporate letterhead gleaming under the kitchen light. Margaret pressed her reading glasses higher on her nose and reached for her cup of tea, though it had gone cold hours ago. 6 months into her retirement from teaching high school English, and the novel she'd worked on secretly for 15 years was still homeless. The characters that had lived in her mind for decades, complex, flawed, beautiful characters she'd come to think of as real people, remained trapped in a manuscript that no one seemed to want. The silence of the house pressed against her ears. During her teaching career, there had been constant noise, students chattering, announcements over the PA system, the shuffle of papers, discussions about Shakespeare and Steinbeck. Now the silence felt alive, watchful. Even the clock on the wall seemed to tick more loudly, counting down the seconds until she'd have to make the decision she'd been avoiding. Margaret picked up the email she'd printed out 3 days ago, the one from a small independent publishing house that specialized in debut authors over 50. They were hosting a competition. Winner gets a publishing contract and a $5,000 advance. The deadline was in 2 weeks. The irony wasn't lost on her. For 30 years, she'd encouraged her students to take risks, to put their writing out into the world, to believe in themselves even when no one else did. Your words matter, she'd told hundreds of teenagers over the decades. Your stories deserve to be heard. Yet here she was, at 58, afraid to take her own advice. She walked to the window above the sink, looking out at the garden her husband Thomas had tended with such care before his heart attack 2 years ago. The roses were overgrown now, petals dropping from unpruned bushes. The vegetable beds lay fallow. Everything was falling apart, just like her carefully ordered life. She'd been a teacher for 3 decades, organized and efficient, the kind of woman who kept backup plans for her backup plans. But no plan had prepared her for this kind of transition, this kind of uncertain future. The phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. She almost didn't answer. Too many calls these days were from well-meaning friends asking how the book thing was going, their voices professionally sympathetic but ultimately disinterested. But something made her reach for the receiver. "Mom?" The voice hit her like a physical blow. Jason. Her only child. The one who'd been increasingly distant since he'd moved to New York 3 years ago to work at a prestigious tech startup. The one who'd barely made it back for Thomas's funeral. She sank into the kitchen chair, her hand trembling slightly as she held the phone. "Jason," her voice came out softer than she intended. "What a nice surprise." "Yeah, Mom. It's me." His voice was different, more polished somehow, carrying a subtle confidence that reminded her of the ambitious finance majors she used to teach. "How are things?" The tears came without warning, hot and immediate. She'd spent 6 months managing grief and disappointment like business transactions, organizing funeral arrangements and retirement parties and submission packages to publishers. But hearing her son's voice broke something loose inside her chest. "I'm fine, Shalit. How are you? How's New York?" "It's good. Busy. The company's doing really well. We just secured another round of funding." The pride in his voice was unmistakable. At 32, Jason had already achieved more professional success than Margaret had in her entire career. His tech company developed apps that did something with financial data. She'd never quite understood the details, but she knew it was impressive. Impressive enough that he rarely called anymore. "That's wonderful, honey. I'm so proud of you." "Thanks, Mom." A pause. She could hear him breathing, could almost see him running his fingers through his dark hair the way he used to when he was preparing to ask for something. "So, listen. I'm going to be in town next weekend. The company is sending me to this tech conference in Portland, and I thought maybe I could stay with you instead of at a hotel." The words hung in the air between them. Margaret looked around her kitchen, at the rejection letters scattered across the table, at the too quiet house. That felt like a mausoleum of her former life. She thought of the guest bedroom that needed cleaning, the refrigerator that was embarrassingly empty, the fact that she'd been wearing the same sweatpants for 3 days. Of course, she said quickly, already mentally cataloging everything she needed to do before his arrival. I'd love that. It's been so long. Great. I'll be there Friday afternoon. Should only be for the weekend. Do you need me to pick you up from the airport? No, the company's arranging a car. I'll text you when I'm on my way. His voice had shifted slightly, more distracted now, as if he was already moving on to the next item on his to-do list. Jason, she said, before he could hang up. I'm working on something new. A novel. I've been submitting it to publishers. The silence on the other end lasted just a beat too long. A novel? Like, fiction? Yes. I've actually been working on it for years, but now that I'm retired, I've been able to focus on it more. I'm entering it in a competition. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Another pause. That's nice, Mom. Like a hobby? The word hobby hit her like a slap. As if the hundreds of hours she'd spent crafting sentences, developing characters, and building an entire world were equivalent to collecting stamps or doing crossword puzzles. It's more than a hobby, she said, trying to keep the defensiveness out of her voice. I've always wanted to be a writer. You know that. Right, sure. His tone was indulgent now, the way people talk to children with unrealistic dreams. Well, good for you. It's important to stay busy in retirement. Margaret closed her eyes, swallowing the hurt. Will you read it? When you're here? I'd value your opinion. The hesitation was palpable. I don't know, Mom. I'll be pretty busy with conference prep, and I'm not really much of a fiction reader these days. Mostly business books and industry reports, you know? Of course, she said quickly. I understand. After they hung up, Margaret sat in the silence of her kitchen, the weight of the conversation settling on her shoulders. She looked at the manuscript pages stacked neatly on the corner of the table, secured with a binder clip. The weight of silence, a multi-generational story about a family of women, their secrets, their sacrifices, and their ultimate redemption. A story she'd poured her heart into, drawing on her own experiences and the collective wisdom she'd gained from 30 years of listening to teenagers navigate the complexities of becoming adults. The practical part of her mind, the part that had graded thousands of essays and managed household budgets for decades, whispered that Jason was right. Publishing was a young person's game. The odds were infinitesimal. She was too old, too late, too ordinary. But the teacher in her, the part that had ignited passion in reluctant readers and coaxed beautiful stories from the shyest students, rebelled against that assessment. She'd spent her entire career telling young people that their voices mattered, that literature was the lifeblood of humanity, that stories had the power to change the world. Was she going to abandon those beliefs now, just because the path was difficult? She picked up the information about the competition again, reading it more carefully. The deadline was tight, but not impossible. The entry fee was steep, $100, but manageable. And the judges were respected industry professionals who specialized in literary fiction, exactly the genre she was writing. Before she could change her mind, Margaret opened her laptop and began filling out the entry form. Name, address, email, brief bio. Then came the harder part, the synopsis, the marketing plan, the target audience analysis. All the practical aspects of publishing that had nothing to do with the art of writing itself. As she worked, she thought about Jason's visit. She hadn't seen him in nearly a year, not since last Christmas when he'd flown in for 48 hours and spent most of that time on his phone handling work emergencies. He'd always been ambitious, even as a child, the kind of student who calculated exactly what grade he needed on the final exam to maintain his 4.0 GPA. But somewhere along the way, that ambition had hardened into something colder, more calculating. Success had become his only metric for determining value. She wondered what he would think if he knew that his own mother, a woman who had taught English for 3 decades, who had read thousands of books, who had helped hundreds of students find their voices, was too afraid to find her own. That she'd written and rewritten her novel for 15 years but had only started submitting it after retirement because she was terrified of rejection. That each form letter from a publisher felt like a personal indictment of her worth. The thought made her sit up straighter. Was that really the example she wanted to set? After years of telling her students, and her son, to pursue their passions, to take risks, to believe in themselves? After encouraging countless teenage writers to send their work to literary magazines and contests? With renewed determination, Margaret finished the application, attached her manuscript file, and hit submit before she could second-guess herself. The confirmation email arrived seconds later. Dear Margaret Sullivan, thank you for your submission to the new Voices Over 50 competition. Your entry has been received and will be reviewed by our panel of judges. Winners will be announced on June 15th, 6 weeks away. 6 weeks of waiting, wondering, hoping. 6 weeks until Jason's dismissive hobby comment might be validated or refuted. Margaret closed her laptop and looked around her kitchen, at the rejection letters. She'd been collecting like painful souvenirs. With sudden resolve, she gathered them up, walked to the recycling bin, and dropped them in. Not because she was in denial about the odds against her, but because carrying their weight was not helping her move forward. Then she did something she hadn't done in weeks. She went to her writing desk, opened a fresh document, and began work on a new story. Because regardless of what happened with the competition, regardless of what Jason thought of her hobby, she was a writer. And writers wrote. The knock came at exactly 4:30 on Friday afternoon, just as Jason had texted he would arrive. Margaret had been watching from the living room window since 4 o'clock, her stomach churning with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety that reminded her of parent-teacher conference nights. She'd spent the week cleaning. Not that the house wasn't already reasonably tidy, but she needed something to do with her hands, some way to channel the nervous energy that had kept her awake most nights. She'd also been cooking lasagna from scratch, Jason's favorite chocolate chip cookies, a quiche for breakfast. The refrigerator was now embarrassingly full, as if she were preparing to feed an army rather than one somewhat distant son for 2 days. She smoothed her gray-streaked hair one final time and walked to the front door, her hand hesitating on the knob. Through the peephole, she could see Jason standing on the porch, suitcase at his feet, phone pressed to his ear. He looked thinner than she remembered, sharper somehow, dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than her monthly pension check. Jason, she said, opening the door with a smile she hoped didn't reveal her nervousness. He held up one finger, indicating he needed to finish his call. Yes, I understand the parameters. We'll have the projections ready for Monday's meeting. Yes. Absolutely. Okay, gotta go. I'll circle back on this later. He ended the call and slipped the phone into his pocket before looking up at her. Hi, Mom. His smile was genuine, if a bit tired around the edges. He stepped forward and gave her a quick, one-armed hug, the kind that was meant to satisfy the requirements of filial affection without actually requiring much physical contact. Come in, Margaret said, stepping back. How was your flight? Fine. Cramped. But the car service was on time, so that's something. He picked up his suitcase and followed her into the house, his eyes taking in the living room with the observant gaze of someone noticing all the things that had changed, and all the things that hadn't, since his last visit. I've put you in your old room, Margaret said, suddenly self-conscious about the house. It was modest compared to whatever sleek city apartment Jason now occupied. The furniture was comfortable but showing its age. The decor was more shabby chic than modern minimalist. I hope that's okay. It's fine, Mom. It's just for 2 nights. He set his suitcase down and loosened his tie. The place looks good. Different. Margaret had repainted the living room after Thomas died, changing it from the beige they'd compromised on to the sage green she'd always wanted. She'd also rearranged the furniture, positioning her reading chair by the window where the natural light was best for writing. Her laptop sat open on the side table, next to a stack of books about the publishing industry. I've made some changes, she admitted. It felt like time for something new. Jason nodded, but his attention had already shifted to his phone, which had buzzed with a notification. He pulled it out, frowning slightly at whatever message had appeared. Why don't you get settled while I finish getting dinner ready? Margaret suggested. Lasagna should be done in about 20 minutes. You didn't have to go to all that trouble, Jason said, though he didn't look up from his phone. I could have picked something up. It's no trouble. I enjoy cooking. The truth was more complicated. She'd spent hours preparing his favorite foods as a form of apology, for the modest house, for her unfashionable appearance, for the fact that she was still just a retired English teacher while he was out conquering the business world. For the fact that she was pursuing a dream he clearly thought was ridiculous. As Jason headed upstairs with his suitcase, Margaret returned to the kitchen, checking on the lasagna and tossing a simple salad. She'd set the dining room table with her good dishes, the ones they'd only used for special occasions when Jason was growing up. Thomas had always insisted that they use the good stuff regularly. What are we saving it for, he'd ask, but Margaret had been raised to keep the best things for special days. Jason's visit qualified. When he came back downstairs, he'd changed from his suit into jeans and a cashmere sweater that looked both casual and expensive. His dark hair was slightly damp, as if he'd splashed water on his face to refresh himself after the travel day. Something smells good, he said, entering the kitchen. Can I help with anything? You could open the wine, Margaret suggested, gesturing to the bottle of Cabernet she'd splurged on. Glasses are in the usual cabinet. As Jason busied himself with the corkscrew, Margaret snuck glances at him. When had her boy become this polished, slightly remote man? She remembered him at 17, passionate about debate team and student government, staying up late to finish papers that were already excellent but that he wanted to make perfect. He'd been driven even then, but there had been joy in his ambition, a genuine excitement about ideas and possibilities. Now he seemed harder somehow, more narrowly focused. So tell me about this conference, she said as they sat down to dinner. What will you be doing there? Jason launched into an explanation that involved venture capital, market disruption, scalable solutions, and several other terms that Margaret couldn't quite follow. But she nodded encouragingly, asking questions when she could, genuinely trying to understand this world that meant so much to him. Anyway, he concluded after describing a panel he would be speaking on, it's a good opportunity for networking. We're looking for another round of funding, and some key investors will be there. It sounds impressive, Margaret said sincerely. I'm so proud of what you've accomplished. Jason smiled, a flash of the boy he'd been briefly visible beneath the polished exterior. Thanks, Mom. It's been a lot of work, but it's paying off. There was a moment of comfortable silence as they ate. Margaret had always believed that preparing food for someone was an act of love, and she'd put all her maternal worry and hope into this meal. She was gratified to see Jason take second helpings of both lasagna and salad. This is really good, he said between bites. I don't get home-cooked meals very often. Mostly takeout or business dinners. You could learn to cook, Margaret suggested. Your father was an excellent cook. A shadow passed over Jason's face at the mention of Thomas. He'd been close to his father, closer in many ways than he was to Margaret. Thomas had understood Jason's ambition, had nurtured it, had been an ambitious man himself though in a quieter, more measured way. His death had created a gulf between mother and son that neither quite knew how to bridge. Maybe someday, Jason said, dismissing the idea as if cooking were one more thing he might get around to after he'd achieved all his professional goals. When things settle down a bit. Of course, Margaret agreed, though she wondered if things would ever settle down for Jason. He seemed to thrive on the constant forward momentum, always reaching for the next achievement, the next milestone. As they ate dessert, Thomas's favorite apple crisp with vanilla ice cream, Margaret gathered her courage. I submitted my novel to that competition I mentioned. The one for writers over 50. Jason paused, his spoon halfway to his mouth. Oh, right. Your book. The slight emphasis on your didn't escape her notice. As if it were a curiosity, something slightly embarrassing, like an elderly woman taking up skateboarding. Yes, my book, she said, trying to keep her voice even. It's a family saga spanning 3 generations of women. Set partly in Maine, where your grandmother grew up. Sounds interesting. Jason's tone suggested it was anything but. When will you hear about the contest? June 15th. About 5 weeks from now. And if you win? What then? Margaret had thought about this question extensively. If I win, they publish the book. There's a small advance, some marketing support. If I don't win, well, I'll keep trying. I've been researching other small presses, and there's also self-publishing, though that route is more complicated. Jason's expression was skeptical. Isn't publishing really competitive? I mean, everyone thinks they have a book in them. The dismissal stung, especially coming from the son she'd raised to believe he could accomplish anything he set his mind to. Yes, it's competitive, she acknowledged. But so is the tech industry. So is anything worth doing. Jason had the grace to look slightly abashed. You're right, of course. I just don't want to see you disappointed. Disappointment is part of any creative endeavor, Margaret said, the teacher in her emerging. I spent 30 years teaching teenagers about resilience, about picking themselves up after failure and trying again. I'd be a hypocrite if I wasn't willing to practice what I preached. Jason studied her for a moment, as if seeing a side of his mother he hadn't recognized before. You're really serious about this, aren't you? I am, Margaret confirmed. I've always been serious about it. I just didn't have the courage to pursue it while I was teaching. Or the time, really. Can I read it? The question surprised her. Your book, I mean. I'd like to see what you've been working on. Margaret hesitated. Jason's world was so different from the one she wrote about. His taste in the few books he read ran toward business biographies and pop psychology, not literary fiction about complicated family dynamics. But she'd asked for this, hadn't she? Asked him to take an interest. I'd like that, she said finally. I have a printed copy in my office. I'll get it for you before you go to bed. Later, after the dishes were done and they'd caught up on news about extended family and mutual friends, Margaret handed Jason a manila envelope containing her manuscript. "No pressure," she said quickly. "I know you're busy with the conference. But if you have time..." "I'll make time," Jason promised, though she noticed he set the envelope on his bedside table without opening it. "Good night, Mom. Thanks for dinner." After he went upstairs, Margaret sat in her reading chair by the window, looking out at the spring night. The conversation had gone better than she'd feared. Jason hadn't outright laughed at her literary ambitions, even if his skepticism had been clear. She wondered what he would think of her writing, if he actually read it. Would he recognize pieces of himself in the characters? Would he understand the themes of sacrifice and redemption that ran through the narrative? Or would he see only the technical flaws, the moments where her confidence had faltered and her prose had become tentative? The house creaked and settled around her, the familiar sounds of home both comforting and somehow lonely. Jason was under her roof, yet she still felt the distance between them, a gulf created by different values, different definitions of success, different ways of moving through the world. She picked up her laptop and opened the document she'd been working on before Jason arrived, a new story, one that had come to her after submitting her novel to the competition. It was about a woman in her 50s starting over, finding her voice after decades of silence. Pure fiction, of course. She smiled at her own transparency and began to type, losing herself in the world of her imagination as her son slept upstairs, surrounded by the pages of her dream. The next morning, Margaret woke early, a habit from 30 years of teaching that retirement hadn't broken. She made coffee and carried a cup out to the back porch, watching the sun rise over the garden she'd been neglecting. The roses needed pruning badly, the vegetable beds were choked with weeds, and the bird feeder hung empty. Thomas would have been disappointed. "Morning." Jason's voice startled her. He stood in the doorway, already dressed in what she assumed was conference attire, dark jeans, a button-down shirt, and a blazer that managed to look both casual and authoritative. "You're up early," she observed, surprised. Jason had always been a late sleeper, especially on weekends. "Jet lag," he explained, pouring himself a cup of coffee and joining her on the porch. "Plus I have to review my presentation before the panel this afternoon." He gestured toward the garden. "Place needs some work." The assessment stung, though she knew it wasn't meant as criticism. "I haven't had the energy for it since your father died," she admitted. "He was the one with the green thumb." Jason nodded, sipping his coffee as he surveyed the overgrown space. "I could help you clear some of it out tomorrow before I leave. If you want." The offer touched her. "That would be nice. Thank you." They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, watching a pair of chickadees investigate the empty bird feeder. Then Jason cleared his throat. "I started reading your manuscript last night." Margaret's heart jumped. "Oh? I only got through the first few chapters. I was pretty tired. But it's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Jason considered the question. "I don't know. Something more amateur, I guess? But your writing is really good, Mom. The characters feel real." The praise, however qualified, warmed her more than she would have anticipated. "Thank you. I've been working on it for a long time, I can tell." He hesitated. "The daughter in the story, Eliza, she reminds me a little of you." Margaret smiled. "There's probably some of me in all the characters. That's how fiction works. We draw from our own experiences, our own emotions, even when we're creating people who are nothing like us on the surface." Jason nodded thoughtfully. "The mother-daughter relationship is complicated. All that unspoken tension, the things they can't say to each other." "All relationships are complicated when you look closely enough," Margaret observed. "Even, perhaps especially, family ones." Something shifted in Jason's expression, a brief vulnerability that reminded Margaret of the sensitive boy he'd been before ambition and achievement had become his armor. "I'll read more tonight," he promised. "After the conference." "No pressure," Margaret repeated, though secretly she was thrilled that he was engaging with her work at all. "Tell me about your presentation. What's it about?" As Jason launched into an explanation of market disruption and investment strategies, Margaret listened with genuine interest, not just because she wanted to understand her son's world, but because she recognized that this was his passion, his art form in a way. The language might be different, the goals and metrics entirely foreign to her, but the underlying drive to create something meaningful wasn't so different from her own writerly ambitions. After breakfast, Jason left for the conference, promising to be back for dinner. Margaret spent the morning cleaning, then sat down at her desk to work on her new story. The words flowed more easily than usual, perhaps energized by Jason's unexpected interest in her novel, or perhaps simply because writing had become her daily practice, as essential to her well-being as the morning coffee. When Jason returned that evening, he seemed buoyant, energized by a successful day of networking and presentations. Over the Thai food they'd ordered in, Margaret had offered to cook again, but Jason had insisted she take a break. He told her about the connections he'd made, the potential investors he'd impressed, the competitors he'd sized up. "It sounds like you're really in your element at these events," Margaret observed. "I am," Jason agreed. "I know it probably seems shallow to you, all this focus on growth metrics and market share. But I genuinely believe our product makes people's financial lives better. We're democratizing access to tools that were once only available to the wealthy." "That doesn't sound shallow at all," Margaret said. "It sounds meaningful. Important." Jason looked surprised, as if he'd expected judgment rather than understanding. "Thanks, Mom. That means a lot." After dinner, while Margaret loaded the dishwasher, Jason disappeared upstairs. When he came back down, he was carrying her manuscript. "I read a few more chapters during breaks today," he said, sitting down at the kitchen table. "I have some thoughts. If you want to hear them." Margaret dried her hands on a dish towel and joined him, both eager and apprehensive. "I'd love to hear them." To her surprise, Jason's feedback was insightful and specific. He pointed out a scene where the tension lagged, a character whose motivations weren't entirely clear, a piece of dialogue that felt too expository. But he also identified the moments that moved him, the descriptions that brought the setting to life, the relationships that felt authentic and compelling. "You've always been a good reader," Margaret said when he finished. "Even when you were young. You could always see right to the heart of a story." "I had a good teacher," Jason replied with a small smile. "Several of them, actually, but one in particular." The compliment touched her deeply. "I'll consider all of this when I revise," she promised. "Assuming I get the chance." "You will," Jason said with unexpected confidence. "If not with this competition, then somewhere else. Your writing deserves to be published, Mom." The validation she'd been seeking for months, years, really, came from the most unexpected source. Her pragmatic, business-minded son, who had initially dismissed her writing as a retirement hobby, now sat across from her talking about her characters as if they were real people, discussing her plot points with the same analytical acumen he brought to his tech ventures. "What changed?" she asked finally. "Yesterday you seemed pretty skeptical about this whole writing endeavor." Jason considered the question. "I guess I hadn't really thought about it seriously. About what it meant to you. But reading your work." He gestured to the manuscript. "This isn't a hobby, Mom. This is who you are." The simple truth of his statement brought unexpected tears to her eyes. "Yes," she agreed. "It is." They talked for hours that night, longer and more openly than they had in years. About her writing, about his business, about Thomas and the grief they both still carried, about the distance that had grown between them and the tentative bridge they were now building. When Margaret finally went to bed, exhausted but happier than she'd been in months, she realized that regardless of whether she won the competition, regardless of whether her novel was ever published, she had already received the validation that mattered most. Her son, her hypercritical, success-driven son, had looked at her work and seen its value. Had looked at her and seen not just his mother, the retired English teacher, but a writer with something meaningful to say. The following morning, they worked together in the garden, clearing weeds and pruning the overgrown roses. It was physical, satisfying work, and as they labored side by side in the spring sunshine, Margaret felt a connection to both the past and the future. To Thomas, who had loved this garden, and to Jason, who was helping her reclaim it. To the writer she had always been in her heart, and to the published author she still hoped to become. When it was time for Jason to leave, their goodbye was warmer than it had been in years. "I want a signed copy," he said as he hugged her. "When the book is published. I want to be able to tell people my mom is a famous author." Famous might be stretching it, Margaret laughed, but the image pleased her. "But yes, you'll get the first signed copy. I promise." As his car pulled away, Margaret stood in the doorway, watching until it disappeared around the corner. Then she went inside, to her desk, to her laptop, to the new story that was taking shape under her fingers. Because regardless of what happened with the competition, regardless of the publishing industry's verdict on her worth, she was a writer. And writers wrote. The grandfather clock in the hallway, a wedding present from Thomas's parents 35 years ago, chimed 3 times, marking the passage of hours since she'd sat down to work. Margaret looked up from her laptop, surprised at how much time had passed, how many words she'd written. The story was flowing more smoothly now, with a confidence she hadn't felt before Jason's visit, before his unexpected validation of her work. The house around her felt different too. No longer a mausoleum of her former life, but a place of possibility, of creativity, of new beginnings. In the garden, the roses she and Jason had pruned were already standing taller, reaching toward the sun with renewed vigor. Everything was changing, including her, especially her. And for the first time in years, the prospect of change felt not terrifying, but exhilarating. The email arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning in early June, nearly 3 weeks after Jason's visit. Margaret was at her desk, working on a new short story while her novel sat in the digital queue of the New Voices Over 50 competition. The cheerful ping of her inbox normally wouldn't have distracted her. Years of teaching had taught her to focus despite interruptions, but the sender's name caught her eye: Elizabeth Chen, Senior Editor, Luminous Press. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she clicked to open it. Luminous Press was the publishing house running the competition. The results weren't supposed to be announced for another week. Dear Ms. Sullivan, the email began, I'm writing regarding your submission to the New Voices Over 50 competition. While we haven't yet selected our final winner, I wanted to reach out personally about your manuscript, The Weight of Silence. Would you be available for a phone call tomorrow to discuss your work? Please let me know a convenient time. Margaret read the message 3 times, her heart pounding. What did it mean? Were they calling all the finalists? Was this a courtesy rejection? Was she getting her hopes up for nothing? She picked up her phone to call Jason, then set it down again. No. She wouldn't burden him with her anxiety, her need for reassurance. He was busy with his company, preparing for another funding round. Besides, she didn't want to appear desperate for his approval, not when they'd just established a more balanced relationship during his visit. Instead, she wrote a carefully worded reply to Elizabeth Chen, suggesting 11 o'clock the following morning for their call. The editor's response came within minutes: perfect. I look forward to speaking with you. That night, Margaret barely slept. She'd been rejected by agents and publishers before, but never had anyone wanted to actually speak to her about her work. In her experience, rejection came in the form of form letters or terse emails. Success, if this was success, was entirely unfamiliar territory. By morning, she'd convinced herself that Elizabeth Chen was calling to let her down gently, to offer encouragement while ultimately passing on her manuscript. Your writing shows promise, she imagined the editor saying, but it's not quite right for our list. The same polite dismissal she'd heard dozens of times before. At exactly 11 o'clock, her phone rang. Hello, Margaret Sullivan speaking. Ms. Sullivan, this is Elizabeth Chen from Luminous Press. Thank you for making time to speak with me today. Of course, Margaret replied, struggling to keep her voice steady. I appreciate you reaching out. I'll get right to the point, Elizabeth said, her voice warm and professional. I've been reading submissions for the New Voices competition, and your manuscript stood out immediately. The depth of your characters, the emotional resonance of your story, it's exactly the kind of work we're looking to publish. Margaret sat down abruptly, her legs suddenly unsteady. That's wonderful to hear. The competition results won't be officially announced until next week, but I wanted to contact you personally to let you know that you're one of our top 3 finalists. The judging panel is meeting on Friday to make the final decision. 1. Of the top 3, Margaret repeated, the words barely registering. Out of hundreds of submissions, her manuscript had risen to the top. Her story, her characters, her words had connected with readers who didn't know her, who had no reason to be kind. Yes, and regardless of the final outcome, I wanted to discuss the possibility of publishing your work. If you don't win the grand prize, we'd still be interested in offering you a contract, albeit with a smaller advance. Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth, trying to contain the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything right now, Elizabeth assured her. I know this is a lot to process. Why don't I send you some information about our press, our editorial approach, and what you might expect if we move forward together? Then, after the competition results are announced next week, we can talk more concretely about next steps. That sounds perfect, Margaret managed. Thank you. Thank you so much. After they hung up, Margaret sat motionless at her desk, the reality of what had just happened slowly sinking in. Her manuscript, the story she'd carried in her heart for so many years, might actually become a book. A real book that people could hold in their hands, could read, could be moved by. She wanted to call someone to share this momentous news. But who? Her colleagues from school were enjoying their own retirements, busy with grandchildren and travel. Her friends, while supportive, had never quite understood her writing ambitions. Thomas would have known exactly what to say, would have celebrated this victory with unabashed enthusiasm. But Thomas was gone. Almost without conscious decision, she found herself dialing Jason's number. It went to voicemail after 4 rings. Not surprising given that it was the middle of a workday. "Jason, it's Mom," she said after the beep. "I just got some exciting news about my book. Nothing definite yet, but, well, call me when you can." She hung up, already second-guessing herself. Jason had shown interest in her manuscript during his visit, had offered thoughtful feedback, had even said he wanted a signed copy someday. But that was in the safe context of a hypothetical future. Now that her publishing dreams were potentially becoming reality, would he still be supportive? Or would he revert to seeing her writing as a retirement hobby, a cute distraction for his aging mother? To distract herself from these anxieties, Margaret threw herself into cleaning. She vacuumed the entire house, scrubbed the kitchen counters, reorganized her spice rack, and was contemplating tackling the garage when her phone rang. Jason's name flashed on the screen. "Mom? What's going on?" "Your message sounded important." Margaret took a deep breath. "I just got a call from the publisher, the one running the competition. I'm one of the top 3 finalists, and they want to publish my book regardless of whether I win the grand prize." A pause. "Are you serious? Mom, that's incredible." The genuine excitement in his voice caught her off guard. "You think so?" "Of course I think so. This is huge. Do you know how many people try to get published and never make it this far? You're going to be a published author." His enthusiasm was contagious, and Margaret found herself laughing, a pure, joyful sound she hadn't heard from herself in months. "I can hardly believe it. They're making the final decision on Friday, but the editor said they want to publish my book either way." "We need to celebrate," Jason declared. "I'm coming back to Portland this weekend." "What? No, honey. You don't need to do that. I know how busy you are with the company." "Mom, this is important. Your first book deal. I wouldn't miss it. I can fly in Friday night, stay through Sunday. We'll go out to dinner somewhere fancy on Saturday to celebrate." The offer touched her deeply. Jason rarely altered his carefully planned schedule, rarely made spontaneous trips across the country. That he would do so for her writing success, felt like a validation even more meaningful than the editor's interest. "If you're sure," she said, not wanting to impose but desperately hoping he meant it. "Absolutely sure. I'll text you my flight details once I book them." After they hung up, Margaret stood in her too-clean kitchen, absorbing the seismic shift that had just occurred in her life. In the space of a few hours, she'd gone from a retired teacher with unrealistic dreams to a soon-to-be published author with a son who was flying across the country to celebrate her success. The rest of the week passed in a blur of nervous anticipation. Margaret tried to work on her new story, but found it impossible to focus. She took long walks around her neighborhood, spent hours in the garden she and Jason had begun to reclaim, and compulsively checked her email every 15 minutes, though she knew the final decision wouldn't come until Friday. When the call finally came, she was deadheading roses in the garden, her phone tucked into the pocket of her jeans. She almost didn't hear it ring over the sounds of birds and distant lawnmowers. "Margaret Sullivan," she answered, her voice steadier than she felt. "Margaret, it's Elizabeth Chen. I'm calling with the results of the competition." Margaret's grip tightened on her garden shears. "Yes? I'm delighted to tell you that The Weight of Silence has been selected as our grand prize winner. Congratulations." The world seemed to tilt slightly. "I won?" "You won," Elizabeth confirmed, a smile in her voice. The judges were unanimous in their decision. "Your manuscript stood out for its emotional depth, its technical skill, and its powerful exploration of family dynamics across generations. It's exactly the kind of voice we created this competition to discover." Margaret sank onto a garden bench, her legs suddenly unable to support her. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything right now. Take some time to process this. We'll send over the formal offer letter and contract next week. The prize includes a $5,000 advance, professional editing, cover design, marketing support, and of course, publication in both print and digital formats. We're tentatively looking at a spring release date, which gives us time for a thorough editorial process." "Spring," Margaret repeated. "That seems so soon." Elizabeth laughed. "In publishing, 9 months is actually quite quick. There's a lot that goes into turning a manuscript into a finished book. But we'll walk you through every step." After the call ended, Margaret sat in the garden, surrounded by the roses she'd been tending, trying to absorb the reality of what had just happened. She'd won. Her novel would be published. Strangers would read her words, would meet her characters, would enter the world she'd created. The garden seemed suddenly more vivid, colors brighter, scents stronger, the sounds of birds and distant traffic more distinct. Was this what it felt like to achieve a lifelong dream? This heightened awareness, this sense of the world shifting slightly on its axis? She thought of the high school students she'd taught for 3 decades, the ones who'd shared their writing with her, their hopes, their fears of rejection. She'd always told them that the act of creation was valuable in itself, that external validation was secondary to the authenticity of their expression. She believed that, truly. But now, experiencing the validation she claimed didn't matter, she understood its power. When Jason arrived that evening, he found her in the kitchen, cooking as if for an army, Thomas's famous paella, fresh bread, a chocolate cake cooling on the counter. "Mom," he called, dropping his suitcase by the door and hurrying to embrace her. "Congratulations. I knew you could do it." The hug was different from the one they'd shared during his last visit, fuller, longer, an embrace between equals rather than the dutiful greeting of a son to his mother. "Thank you for coming," Margaret said, stepping back to look at him. He seemed different somehow, less polished, more present. He'd changed from his usual business attire into jeans and a casual shirt, his hair slightly rumpled from the flight. "Are you kidding? I wouldn't miss this." He gestured to the elaborate meal in progress. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble. We could have ordered in. Cooking helps me process," Margaret explained. "When I'm happy, when I'm nervous, when I'm trying to make sense of things. Your father was the same way." Jason's expression softened at the mention of Thomas. "He would have been so proud of you, Mom. So incredibly proud." The simple truth of this statement brought unexpected tears to Margaret's eyes. "I think he would have been surprised, actually. I never really shared my writing with him. Not the serious stuff, anyway." "Why not?" Jason looked genuinely curious. Margaret considered the question as she stirred the paella. "Fear, I suppose. Fear that he wouldn't like it, or worse, that he would pretend to like it because he loved me. Fear that putting my words on the page would somehow make me more vulnerable than I wanted to be in our marriage." Dad wasn't exactly big on vulnerability either, Jason observed, reaching for the bottle of champagne he'd brought. "Should we open this now or with dinner?" "Now," Margaret decided. "I think we've waited long enough to celebrate." As Jason popped the cork and poured 2 glasses, Margaret found herself studying her son with new eyes. When had he developed this emotional intelligence, this capacity to discuss difficult truths without deflection or judgment? Had it always been there, beneath the ambitious exterior? Or was it something new, a sign of his own growth and maturation? "To your success," Jason said, raising his glass. "And to many more books to come." They clinked glasses, the crystal making a clear, pure sound in the warm kitchen. "And to unexpected second acts," Margaret added. "To discovering that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be." They talked for hours that night, through dinner and dessert and a second bottle of wine that Jason ran out to purchase when the champagne was gone. Their conversation ranged widely, from Margaret's novel and the publishing process ahead, to Jason's company and the challenges of startup culture, to memories of Thomas and the life they'd shared as a family. "I never really understood you," Jason admitted as the evening wound down. "Growing up, I mean. Dad was the straightforward one, ambitious, practical, focused on tangible achievements. But you were harder to figure out. All those books, all those ideas, all that passion for stories and words. I didn't get it." "And now?" Margaret asked, curious about how he saw her now, in this new phase of her life. "Now I see that you were the brave one," Jason said simply. "You were the one who understood that life is about more than measurable successes. It's about meaning, about connection, about creating something that outlasts you." The insight startled her. "I don't know if I was brave. I hid my writing for years, only working on it in stolen moments between grading papers and making dinner and attending your soccer games." "But you never gave up on it," Jason pointed out. "Even when it would have been easier to just be a teacher, a wife, a mother, you held on to this other part of yourself. You protected it until it was strong enough to stand on its own." Margaret had never thought of her decades-long writing practice as an act of courage, but seen through her son's eyes, perhaps it was a quiet, persistent rebellion against the narrowing of identity that so often came with middle age, with marriage, with motherhood. "I think we're more alike than either of us realized," she said finally. "We both have this stubbornness, this refusal to let go of the things that matter to us." Jason laughed. "Dad used to call it the Sullivan streak. Remember? He said it was like trying to argue with a stone wall." The memory made Margaret smile. Thomas had indeed recognized and respected their shared tenacity, even when it had driven him to distraction. He wasn't wrong. Later, after Jason had gone up to bed, Margaret sat in her reading chair by the window. Looking out at the night garden she could barely see but could sense the shapes of rose bushes and hedges, the open space of lawn, the boundaries that contained and defined the natural world. Her life felt like that garden now, still familiar. In its outlines, but changing, growing, becoming something new and yet connected to what had come before. The retired teacher was becoming an author. The widow was becoming a woman in her own right. The mother was becoming a mentor to the son who had once dismissed her dreams. She picked up her phone and reread the email Elizabeth had sent after their call, confirming her win and outlining next steps. There would be a formal contract to sign, editorial notes to address, marketing questions to consider. The road from manuscript to published book was longer than she'd realized, with more twists and potential pitfalls than she'd anticipated. But she wasn't walking it alone. She had an editor who believed in her work, a son who was rediscovering his respect for her, and perhaps most importantly, a newfound faith in her own voice, her own story, her own worth. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, marking the end of one of the most extraordinary days of her life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new uncertainties, new opportunities for both failure and success. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of her home, Margaret Sullivan allowed herself to simply savor the moment, this perfect, fleeting moment when a lifelong dream had finally, improbably, come true. The editorial process began in earnest too. Weeks later, Margaret had signed the contract, deposited the advance check, and was now facing the first major hurdle of her new career, revisions. Elizabeth had sent a 10-page editorial letter, filled with thoughtful observations, probing questions, and suggestions for strengthening the manuscript. Remember, Elizabeth had written at the end of her letter, "These are just suggestions. You're the author. You know your story best. But I hope these thoughts will help you see your work with fresh eyes." Margaret sat at her desk, the letter printed out and annotated with her own notes, feeling simultaneously exhilarated and overwhelmed. The editor had loved her book enough to award it the grand prize, but still saw so many ways it could be improved. Was this normal? Was she about to be exposed as a fraud, an amateur who had somehow slipped past the gatekeepers? She picked up her phone and dialed Jason before she could talk herself out of it. "Hey, Mom," he answered, the sounds of an office buzzing in the background. "Everything okay?" "I got the editorial letter for the book," she said, trying to keep the anxiety out of her voice. "It's extensive." "That's good, right? It means they're taking your work seriously." "I suppose," Margaret agreed. "But what if I can't do what they're asking? What if I make it worse instead of better?" Jason was quiet for a moment, and she could almost see him thinking, choosing his words carefully. "Remember when I was working on my college application essays? How I kept asking you to read them, and you kept sending them back with more questions than answers?" "I remember you being quite frustrated with me," Margaret said, smiling at the memory. "I was. But you told me something I've never forgotten. You said, 'I'm not asking these questions because your essay is bad. I'm asking them because it's good. Enough to be better.'" Margaret's breath caught. Her own words from more than a decade ago, remembered and now returned to her when she needed them most. "I said that?" "You did. And you were right. The questions made me dig deeper, think more clearly, express myself more precisely. They didn't diminish my work, they elevated it." The perspective shift was immediate and profound. Of course, Elizabeth wasn't questioning the worth of her manuscript, she was investing in its potential. She was doing exactly what Margaret herself had done for countless students over the years, pushing for excellence because she believed it was possible. "When did you get so wise?" Margaret asked, her anxiety receding. "I had a good teacher," Jason replied simply. After they hung up, Margaret returned to the editorial letter with new eyes. Yes, the suggested revisions were substantial. Yes, they would require significant work. But they were also insightful, respectful, and clearly aimed at making her good book even better. She opened her laptop and began to work, addressing Elizabeth's questions one by one, deepening character motivations, clarifying plot points, strengthening thematic connections. The process was challenging but also deeply satisfying, like solving a complex puzzle or untangling a knotted necklace, difficult but worthwhile. Days turned into weeks as Margaret immersed herself in revisions. She established a routine, writing in the morning when her mind was freshest, taking walks in the afternoon to clear her head, returning to the manuscript in the evening to review and refine. The discipline she'd developed during her teaching career served her well now, helping her maintain focus and momentum even when the work became difficult. She spoke with Jason at least once a week, updating him on her progress, sharing both breakthroughs and frustrations. To her surprise, he took a genuine interest in the editorial process, asking perceptive questions and offering encouragement. When she faltered, "It's not so different from what I do," he observed during one of their calls. The iterative nature of it, the constant refinement, the balance between defending your vision and being open to feedback. Whether it's code or prose, creating something that connects with an audience requires both stubbornness and flexibility. The comparison hadn't occurred to Margaret, but she could see the parallels. Both she and Jason were builders in their own way, she with words, he with technology. Both created structures that needed to be both functional and elegant. Both worked within constraints while pushing boundaries. I think you're right, she said, pleased by this unexpected common ground. Though I suspect your work has more immediate, practical application than my family saga. I wouldn't be so sure, Jason replied. People need stories as much as they need apps. Maybe more. By the end of July, Margaret had completed her revisions and returned the manuscript to Elizabeth. The waiting began again. Would the editor be pleased with the changes? Had Margaret addressed the concerns adequately? Had she maintained the heart of her story while strengthening its weaker elements? The answer came a week later in an enthusiastic email from Elizabeth. You've done beautiful work, she wrote. The manuscript is so much stronger now, while still maintaining all the emotional resonance that made me fall in love with it in the first place. There are still a few small tweaks I'd like to suggest, but we're essentially ready to move into copy editing. The validation was sweet, made even sweeter by Margaret's knowledge of how hard she'd worked to earn it. This wasn't luck or charity. This was the result of decades of practice, months of intensive revision, and a lifetime of studying the craft of storytelling. As summer turned to fall, the book moved through the next stages of production. Margaret worked with a copy editor on grammar and consistency, consulted with the design team on cover concepts, and began discussing marketing strategies with the publicity department. Each step brought new challenges, new decisions, new opportunities to shape the final product that would bear her name. Throughout the process, she kept Jason updated, sending him cover mock-ups for his opinion, sharing marketing ideas, discussing potential titles. They had decided that The Weight of Silence might be too similar to existing books. What do you think of The Inheritance of Memory? She asked during their weekly call in early October. I like it, Jason said after considering it. It captures the multi-generational aspect, and there's something poetic about it without being too abstract. That's what I thought too, Margaret agreed. Elizabeth likes it as well. I think we finally found our title. The Inheritance of Memory, by Margaret Sullivan, Jason said, testing it out. It sounds like a real book. Margaret laughed. That's the idea. When's the release date again? April 15th, tax day, appropriately enough, since this whole experience has been equal parts rewarding and taxing. Jason groaned at the pun. Dad would have loved that joke. He would have, Margaret agreed, smiling at the memory of Thomas's appreciation for wordplay, no matter how corny. I've been thinking about him a lot lately, wondering what he would make of all this. He'd be proud, Jason said with certainty. Maybe a little surprised, but definitely proud. Margaret wasn't so sure. Their marriage had been solid, loving, but also characterized by certain unspoken agreements about roles and expectations. Thomas had been supportive of her teaching career, but had he ever truly seen her as a writer? Had she even given him the chance to? I don't know if I ever let him see this part of me fully, she admitted. I kept my writing separate, private. It was easier that way, less vulnerable. Why do you think that was? Jason asked, his tone genuinely curious rather than judgmental. Margaret considered the question. Fear, I suppose. Fear that he wouldn't understand, or worse, that he would humor me without really believing in my potential. It was easier to keep my dreams to myself than to risk having them diminished, even unintentionally. I get that, Jason said, surprising her. I've done the same thing with relationships. Kept parts of myself separate, protected. It feels safer in the moment, but ultimately it's lonely. The insight struck Margaret as remarkably self-aware, especially coming from her achievement-oriented son. When did you get so emotionally intelligent? She asked, only half joking. Therapy, Jason admitted. Started going about a year ago. Work was taking over everything, and I realized I didn't want to end up successful but alone. This was news to Margaret. I had no idea. I didn't tell anyone at first. It felt like admitting weakness or failure. But it's been helpful. I'm learning a lot about myself, about patterns I've developed that don't necessarily serve me well. The conversation marked another shift in their relationship, a new level of honesty, of mutual respect, of seeing each other as complete human beings rather than just as mother and son. They talked for nearly 2 hours that night, about therapy and vulnerability, about Thomas and his influence on both of them, about the balance between ambition and connection, achievement and joy. When they finally hung up, Margaret sat in her reading chair, watching the October darkness gather outside her window, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for this unexpected gift, this evolving, deepening relationship with her adult son, built on the foundation of her own late-blooming courage. The publishing process continued to move forward. In November, Margaret received the first page proofs of her novel, her words transformed into properly typeset pages, looking for all the world like a real book. In December, the final cover design arrived in her inbox, a haunting, beautiful image of a woman looking out over a rugged coastline, the title and her name prominently displayed. "The Inheritance of Memory" by Margaret Sullivan, she whispered, staring at the image on her computer screen. After all these years, all these drafts, all these rejections, it was really happening. In a few months, her book would be on shelves. In readers' hands, in the world. She printed the cover image and pinned it above her desk, a daily reminder of what was coming, of what she had accomplished, of what was still to be done. Because even as the publication process advanced, Margaret continued to write. The new story she'd begun after submitting to the competition had grown into a potential second novel, its characters and conflicts taking shape under her increasingly confident hand. As the winter holidays approached, Jason called with unexpected news. "I'm coming home for Christmas," he said. "Taking the whole week off, actually. The whole week." Margaret couldn't hide her surprise. In recent years, Jason had typically flown in for a whirlwind 48-hour visit, his attention divided between family obligations and work emergencies. "Yeah, I need a real break. And I want to spend some time with you. I've been thinking a lot about what matters, about how I want to live my life. Dad's death, your book, it's all made me realize that success isn't just about career achievements." Margaret felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in her living room. "I'd love to have you home for a whole week. Are you sure your company can spare you?" "They'll have to," Jason said simply. "I'm delegating more, creating stronger systems. The company doesn't need me micromanaging every decision anymore." This was new, Jason loosening his grip on control, creating space for a life beyond work. Margaret couldn't help but wonder if her own late-blooming courage had somehow influenced her son's evolving perspective. When Jason arrived for Christmas, the difference in him was immediately apparent. He was more relaxed, more present, more engaged with the moment rather than constantly checking his phone or thinking about work. He helped Margaret decorate the tree, accompanied her to a holiday concert at her former school, and spent hours reading by the fire while she worked on her new manuscript. On Christmas Eve, after a festive dinner with friends, they sat together in the living room, watching the lights twinkle on the tree, listening to the carols that had been part of their family tradition for decades. "I have something for you," Jason said, reaching behind the couch and pulling out a wrapped package. "I know we usually do presents tomorrow morning, but this one feels right for tonight." Margaret unwrapped the gift carefully, savoring the moment. Inside was a beautiful leather journal, its cover embossed with a single word, "Stories." "Open it," Jason encouraged. She turned to the first page and found a handwritten note from her son. "Mom, for all the stories you've already written, and all the ones still to come. I'm sorry I ever dismissed your dreams as a hobby. You showed me that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. I couldn't be prouder to be your son. Love, Jason." The simple words brought tears to her eyes. "This is the most thoughtful gift anyone has ever given me," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "There's more," Jason said, looking slightly nervous now. "Look at the back." She turned to the final pages of the journal and found several more handwritten pages, not in Jason's handwriting this time, but in Thomas's distinctive, angular script. "What is this?" she whispered, not understanding. "I found it when I was helping you clean out Dad's office last year," Jason explained. "It was in his desk, in an envelope with your name on it. I didn't read it at the time, it seemed too private. But with everything that's happened this year, with your book being published, it felt like the right time to give it to you." Margaret turned to the first page of Thomas's writing, her heart pounding. "My dearest Margaret," it began. "If you're reading this, I'm probably gone. There are things I never found the courage to say to you directly, things I hope you know but want to make sure you hear." The letter continued for several pages, Thomas's reflections on their marriage, his admiration for her intellect and creativity, his regret that his practical nature had sometimes failed to appreciate her more artistic soul. He wrote about finding pages of her writing over the years, reading them in private, being moved by her talent but never knowing how to tell her without seeming to intrude on something she clearly kept separate from their shared life. "You have always been more than you allowed yourself to appear," he wrote near the end. "More complex, more talented, more remarkable than the roles you willingly played, teacher, wife, mother. I hope someday you'll share your stories with the world. They deserve to be read, and you deserve to be heard." Margaret looked up at Jason, tears streaming down her face. "He knew," she whispered. "All those years, he knew about my writing." "He did," Jason confirmed. "And he believed in it, in you. Why didn't he ever say anything?" Jason shrugged. "Maybe for the same reason you never shared it with him. fear, respect for boundaries, the patterns we fall into in long relationships. Margaret turned back to the letter, reading the final lines. Whatever you do with your talents, with your stories, know that I am proud of you, that I have always seen you, all of you, and loved every part. Yours always, Thomas. The validation she hadn't known she needed, the recognition she'd never sought from her husband, arrived now, nearly 3 years after his death, a gift from beyond time. Thomas had seen her, had believed in her, had respected her enough to maintain the boundaries she'd established even as he hoped she would someday break free of them. Thank you, she said to Jason, holding the journal against her heart. This means more than I can express. I think Dad would be happy about how things have turned out, Jason said. Your book being published, you and I finding a new way to connect, both of us discovering parts of ourselves we'd kept hidden. Margaret nodded, too moved to speak. Outside, a light snow had begun to fall, dusting the garden she and Jason had reclaimed, transforming the ordinary world into something magical, unexpected, new. The grandfather clock chimed 11, its familiar sound a reminder of how time moved forward relentlessly and yet how the past remained present in ways both seen and unseen. Thomas was gone, and yet here he was, his words, his love, his recognition of her true self preserved in ink on paper, just as her own words, her own vision, her own heart would soon be preserved in a book bearing her name. Merry Christmas, Mom, Jason said softly. Merry Christmas, my darling boy, Margaret replied, reaching for his hand, grateful beyond words for this moment, for this connection, for this chapter of her life that had begun with rejection and isolation but was continuing with acceptance and love. Whatever came next, whatever readers thought of her book, whatever new stories she might write, whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face it knowing she was seen, she was heard, she mattered. Not just as a mother or a widow or a retired teacher, but as herself. As Margaret Sullivan, author. As a woman who had finally, improbably, wonderfully become who she was always meant to be. The publicity email arrived in Margaret's inbox 2 months before her book's release date, its subject line deceptively simple, Author Events for The Inheritance of Memory. Margaret opened it eagerly, then felt her stomach drop as she read through the proposed schedule. Book signings at major stores in Portland, Seattle, and San Francisco. A reading at her alma mater. Interviews with local newspapers and radio stations. A panel discussion at a regional literary festival. We believe your book has significant potential, wrote Alicia, the publicity coordinator. These events will help build buzz and connect you directly with readers. Please review the schedule and let me know if you have any conflicts. Margaret stared at the screen, her excitement quickly morphing into panic. Public speaking had never been her forte. Even after 30 years of teaching, she still experienced anxiety before each new class, each parent conference, each faculty presentation. The thought of standing before rooms full of strangers, reading her most personal work, answering unpredictable questions, it made her palms sweat and her heart race. She picked up her phone before she could talk herself out of it. Jason Sullivan, her son answered, his voice crisp and professional. It's Mom, Margaret said, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. Do you have a minute? For you? Always. What's up? I'd like that too, Margaret replied, touched by the significance of the gesture. Jason, who had kept his personal life strictly separate from his family for years, was now inviting these worlds to merge. It represented a trust, a lowering of boundaries, that felt like its own kind of gift. Mom? Jason's voice grew serious. I'm really proud of you. For all of it, the book, the publicity stuff, the way you've pushed through your fears. You're kind of my hero right now. The simple words penetrated to her core. Her son, her brilliant, ambitious, guarded son, was proud of her. Saw her courage. Recognized her growth. What greater validation could a parent hope for? Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. That means more than you know. After they hung up, Margaret carried her wine glass to the kitchen, tidying up the last evidence of the evening's gathering. The house felt different now, less a repository of memories, more a launching pad for new experiences. In a few weeks, she would stand before strangers and read her words. Her book would be on shelves, in hands, in minds not her own. Her private thoughts would become public property, open to interpretation, criticism, and perhaps, if she was fortunate, appreciation. The thought still frightened her. But now the fear felt like excitement's twin rather than courage's opponent. She was afraid, and she would do it anyway. She would feel the fear and step forward into the light. The next 6 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Margaret worked with Alicia on her press kit, reviewed the final page proofs, practiced her reading until the selected passages felt like old friends. She bought new clothes for the book tour, outfits that felt both professional and authentically her, not the teacher clothes she'd worn for decades, but the wardrobe of an author claiming her public identity. As the Portland launch event approached, her anxiety returned, but it was tempered now by a growing excitement. This was happening. After decades of secret writing, of dreams deferred, of courage gathered slowly like pennies in a jar, her book was about to meet its readers. The night before the launch, she couldn't sleep. She paced her living room at midnight, rehearsing her reading one more time, checking her bag to make sure she had everything she needed: copies of the book, reading glasses, throat lozenges. The lucky pen Thomas had given her on their 10th anniversary. At 1 a.m., her phone pinged with a text message. It was from Jason. "Still up worrying? Remember, they're coming because they want to hear from you. You've already won them over by writing a book they want to read." The simple reassurance calmed her racing thoughts. Jason was right. The people who would attend her reading weren't coming to judge her. They were coming because something about her book, its title, its description, its premise, had called to them. They were already on her side. She texted back, "Thank you. Now go to sleep. Big day tomorrow." His response came immediately, "You first. Love you." "Love you too," she replied, and found that she could indeed sleep now, her mind quieted by her son's simple wisdom. The Powell's Books event space was larger than Margaret had anticipated, with rows of chairs stretching back farther than she could easily see from the small podium. As she stood backstage with Alicia and the store's events coordinator, peeking out at the gathering crowd, she felt a momentary panic. "There are so many people," she whispered. "It's a great turnout," Alicia confirmed, clearly pleased. "Your advance reviews have generated real interest." Margaret took a deep breath, remembering Jason's text from the night before. These people were here because they wanted to hear from her. They were already on her side. She scanned the crowd, looking for familiar faces. In the front row sat her former colleagues from the English department, Howard at the center, all of them beaming with pride and excitement. A few rows back, she spotted Jason, tall and handsome in a suit that managed to look both professional and relaxed. Beside him was a woman with curly dark hair and a warm smile, Claire, presumably. They were holding hands, Margaret noticed. Another small but significant indicator of how much her son was changing, opening, growing. The events coordinator checked her watch. "Ready, Miss Sullivan? We'll start in about 2 minutes." Margaret nodded, feeling a strange calm settle over her. "I'm ready." The introduction was brief but flattering. The coordinator spoke about Margaret's remarkable debut, about the wisdom and emotional depth of her multi-generational family saga, about the unique perspective she brought as an author publishing her first novel after a 30-year teaching career. And then Margaret was walking to the podium, her advance copy of The Inheritance of Memory in her hands, the applause of the audience washing over her like a wave of goodwill. She adjusted the microphone, set her book on the stand, and looked out at the sea of expectant faces. "Thank you all for coming," she began, and was relieved to hear that her voice sounded strong, clear, confident. "I've spent most of my life helping other people find their voices, as a teacher, a mother, a friend. It took me until my 6th decade to fully find my own." A murmur of appreciation rippled through the audience. Margaret felt herself relaxing into the moment, into the role of author, of storyteller, of guide to the world she had created. "The inheritance of memory began as a question," she continued. "What do we pass down to our children beyond our genes, our heirlooms, our family recipes? What invisible legacies shape their lives, for better or worse?" The story you're about to hear explores one family's attempt to answer that question across 3 generations of women. She opened her book to the marked page and began to read. The words flowed naturally, her voice growing in confidence and expressiveness as she progressed. She looked up occasionally to see faces in the audience rapt with attention, some nodding in recognition of emotional truths, others leaning forward to catch every word. When she finished the first passage, the applause was immediate and enthusiastic. Margaret felt a surge of joy unlike anything she'd experienced before, the pure, unalloyed pleasure of connecting with readers through her words, of seeing her private vision received and valued by others. The Q&A session that followed was lively and engaged. Readers asked about her characters, her themes, her writing process. One woman wanted to know if the grandmother in the story was based on Margaret's own family history. A young man asked about the novel's exploration of female ambition across different eras. An aspiring writer in her 50s asked for advice on pursuing a creative dream later in life. Margaret answered each question thoughtfully, drawing on her years of teaching to articulate complex ideas clearly, finding her own authentic voice as an author in real time, before this audience of strangers who were rapidly becoming allies, supporters, fellow travelers on a literary journey. The signing line afterward was longer than anyone had anticipated. Person after person approached with a newly purchased copy of The Inheritance of Memory, sharing brief but often profound reactions to what they'd heard, asking for personalized inscriptions, expressing gratitude for the story Margaret had chosen to tell. Your book reminded me of my own grandmother, one elderly woman said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She had the same quiet strength as your Eleanor. I'm an English teacher too, confided a young man barely older than Margaret's former students. Your journey gives me hope that my own writing might find its way into the world someday. My book club has already chosen this for next month, announced a middle-aged woman with an armful of copies. We can't wait to discuss it. Each interaction added another layer to Margaret's evolving identity as an author. She wasn't just a retired teacher who had written a book. She was a writer whose words resonated with readers, whose story touched hearts, whose vision mattered to people she had never met before this night. When the line finally dwindled and the last book was signed, Margaret looked up to find Jason and Claire waiting patiently nearby. Jason's expression was one she had rarely seen before, pure, unguarded pride, with no trace of the competitive edge that had often characterized their relationship. "Mom," he said, stepping forward to embrace her. "You were amazing. Absolutely amazing." "I was terrified," Margaret admitted, returning his hug. "But once I started reading, it felt right. Like I was exactly where I was supposed to be." "That's because you were," Jason said simply. Then he turned to the woman beside him. "Mom, this is Claire. Claire, my mother, the author Margaret Sullivan." "It's so wonderful to meet you," Claire said, her smile genuine and warm. "Jason has told me so much about you, and I absolutely loved your reading. Your book deals with exactly the kinds of intergenerational patterns I find fascinating. In my own family." As they talked, Margaret observed the small, telling interactions between Jason and Claire, the way he watched her speak with obvious admiration, the easy physical comfort between them, the shared glances that communicated without words. Her son was falling in love, perhaps already had fallen. And he wanted Margaret to know this woman, to be part of this aspect of his life in a way he had never invited before. Later, over a celebratory dinner at Margaret's favorite restaurant, Jason raised his glass in a toast. "To the most successful book launch in Powell's history," he declared. "And to the bravest woman I know, who taught me that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be." Margaret explained about the publicity schedule, her words tumbling out in a nervous rush. "I don't think I can do this," she concluded. "I'm a writer, not a performer. What if I freeze up? What if no one comes? What if they ask questions I can't answer?" There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Then Jason said, "Mom, can I be completely honest with you?" "Of course," she replied, bracing herself. "This fear you're feeling, it's not about public speaking." "Not really." "What do you mean?" "I think you're afraid of being seen," Jason said gently. "For decades, you've kept your writing private, kept your dreams small enough to fit in the corners of your life. Now you're being asked to step into the spotlight, to claim your achievement publicly. And that's terrifying." The insight hit Margaret with the force of revelation. Jason was right. Her fear wasn't just about stumbling over words or facing a small audience. It was about standing up in front of the world and declaring, "I wrote this. I believe it matters. I believe I matter." "When did you get so insightful?" she asked, partly to buy herself time to process his words. "I've been paying attention," Jason replied. "Watching you go through this journey. And maybe recognizing some of the same patterns in myself, the fear of being truly seen, of being vulnerable in public." Margaret sat with this truth, feeling its weight and wisdom. "So what do I do?" "You do it anyway," Jason said simply. "You feel the fear and you do it anyway. You've already done the hardest part, writing the book, surviving the rejections, persisting until someone recognized your talent. This is just the next step." "Easy for you to say," Margaret retorted. "You give presentations to investors all the time." "And I throw up before every single one," Jason admitted. "Seriously? Ask my assistant." This unexpected confession startled a laugh from Margaret. "You're joking." "I wish I was. But the point is, courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and doing it anyway. You taught me that, remember? In high school, before my first debate tournament." Margaret did remember. 16-year-old Jason, normally so confident, pale and shaking with nerves before he had to speak in front of judges and opponents. She'd held his trembling hands and told him that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. "My words coming back to haunt me," she said with a wry smile he couldn't see. "Your words coming back to guide you," Jason corrected. "You've been preparing for this your whole life, Mom. You've got this." After they hung up, Margaret sat at her desk, considering Jason's perspective. He was right, of course. This fear of public exposure, of claiming space and attention, had shaped her entire life. It had kept her writing hidden in drawers for decades. It had kept her in a supporting role in her marriage, in her career, even in her relationship with her son. But things were different now. She was different. The woman who had submitted her manuscript to a national competition, who had worked with an editor to make her good book better, who had signed a publishing contract, that woman could surely find the courage to read her own words aloud. Margaret opened her laptop and replied to Alicia's email, "The schedule looks wonderful. I'm looking forward to all of it." Then, before she could change her mind, she drafted a message to her former colleagues in the English department at her high school. "Dear friends, I'd like to practice my first author reading with a friendly audience. Would any of you be willing to attend a dry run at my house next Friday evening? Wine and cheese provided, tough questions welcome." The responses came quickly, filled with enthusiasm and support. Of course they would come. They'd always known she was a gifted writer. They couldn't wait to hear her read. They were so proud of her. The affirmation brought tears to Margaret's eyes. For years, she'd kept her writing ambitions separate from her teaching life, afraid of seeming pretentious or setting herself up for public failure. Now she realized how much support had been available to her all along, if only she'd had the courage to ask for it. The week before her practice reading, Margaret worked methodically to prepare. She selected passages that showcased different aspects of the novel, a descriptive scene, a piece of dialogue, a moment of emotional revelation. She practiced reading aloud, recording herself and listening critically to her pacing, her inflection, her clarity. She prepared answers for likely questions, drawing on her years of teaching literary analysis to anticipate what readers might want to know. When Friday evening arrived, Margaret had transformed her living room into a makeshift bookstore event space. Chairs arranged in rows, a small table at the front for her to sit at, copies of advance reader galleys that Elizabeth had sent her stacked neatly beside a vase of fresh flowers. As her former colleagues began to arrive, 8 in total, bearing bottles of wine and small gifts, Margaret felt her anxiety shift into something more like excitement. These were her people. They understood literature, understood the courage it took to put words on a page. If she could read to them, she could read to anyone. "Before we start," said Howard, the department chair who had hired her 31 years ago, "I'd like to propose a toast." He raised his glass, his eyes warm with genuine affection. "To Margaret Sullivan, who taught generations of students to find their voices, and who has now, gloriously, powerfully, found her own. We always knew you had this book in you. We're just delighted that now the whole world will know it too." To Margaret, the others echoed, raising their glasses. The simple ceremony steadied her. With a deep breath, Margaret opened her advance copy of The Inheritance of Memory and began to read. The words flowed more easily than she'd expected, her voice growing stronger and more confident as she progressed. She looked up occasionally to see her friends leaning forward in their chairs, their expressions absorbed, moved, engaged. When she finished the first passage, there was a moment of profound silence, followed by genuine, enthusiastic applause. "That was beautiful, Margaret," said Elaine, who had taught next door to her for 20 years. "I could see it all so clearly. Your prose is gorgeous." The compliment warmed her. "Thank you," she said, and was surprised to find she could accept the praise without deflecting or diminishing it. Another small but significant change. The practice reading turned into a lively literary discussion, with her colleagues asking thoughtful questions about her process, her characters, her themes. Margaret found herself responding with increasing confidence, drawing on the deep knowledge she had of her own work. By the end of the evening, her anxiety about the upcoming public events had transformed into something closer to anticipation. As her friends were leaving, Howard hung back, waiting until they were alone to speak. "I always knew you were holding something back," he said quietly. "All those years of teaching, I could sense there was more to you, more depth, more fire than you were showing." "I was afraid," Margaret admitted. "Afraid of reaching for something and failing publicly." Howard smiled, his eyes crinkled with understanding. The secret that most writers never fully grasp is that the very act of putting words on paper is an act of preposterous courage. To believe that your particular arrangement of 26 letters matters enough to ask for someone else's attention, that's either insanity or bravery of the highest order. "Maybe a bit of both," Margaret suggested. "Maybe a bit of both," Howard agreed. "Either way, I'm proud of you, Margaret. Not just for writing a beautiful book, but for finally letting the world see who you really are." After he left, Margaret sat in her reading chair, surrounded by the evidence of the evening, empty wine glasses, congratulatory cards, the stack of advance reader copies now depleted as each friend had asked to take one home. She felt different somehow, as if the act of reading her work aloud, of claiming it publicly before this small audience of supporters, had shifted something fundamental inside her. The phone rang, startling her from her reflections. It was Jason. "How did it go?" he asked without preamble. "Surprisingly well," Margaret replied. "It was actually fun. See? I told you," Jason said, the smile evident in his voice. "Next stop, Powell's Book's main stage." "Don't remind me," Margaret groaned, but the anxiety that had accompanied that thought earlier in the week felt more manageable now. "How did you know I needed that push? To do the practice reading?" "Because I know you," Jason said simply. "And because I recognize the patterns. The desire to stay safe, to avoid vulnerability. I've been working on it in myself too." "Tell me," Margaret encouraged, genuinely interested in her son's inner life in a way that felt new and precious. Jason hesitated only briefly. "I've been seeing someone. A woman I met at that tech conference in Portland back in the spring. She's smart, funny, kind, and terrifies me because she sees right through my professional facade." "That sounds promising," Margaret said, delighted by this unexpected revelation. "Tell me about her." As Jason described Claire, an environmental scientist who consulted with tech companies on sustainability initiatives, Margaret heard something in his voice she hadn't heard in years. A softness, a vulnerability, an openness to possibility that had been missing during his single-minded climb up the corporate ladder. "She's coming with me to your Portland book launch," Jason said. "I'd like you to meet her." "To Margaret," Claire echoed, raising her own glass. "And to new beginnings, at any age." The simple ceremony brought unexpected tears to Margaret's eyes. "Thank you," she said, looking at her son, this remarkable young man who had grown from dismissing her writing dreams to championing them, from guarding his personal life to sharing it openly. "For everything." The rest of the book tour unfolded with increasing confidence and joy. Each event built on the success of the last, each interaction with readers deepening Margaret's understanding of what her book meant to others, of the connections it created, of the conversations it inspired. In Seattle, a young mother approached her with a sleeping baby in a carrier. "I haven't finished a book since she was born 6 months ago," the woman confessed. "Yours is the first. I stayed up all night reading because I couldn't bear to put it down." In San Francisco, an elderly man waited patiently at the end of the signing line. "My wife was a writer," he told Margaret, his voice wavering slightly. "She never got the chance to publish her work. Seeing you here tonight, I feel like I'm witnessing the life she might have had if she'd lived longer. Thank you for that gift." At the literary festival panel discussion, Margaret found herself speaking with authority and insight alongside authors who had published multiple books, her perspective as both a lifelong teacher of literature and a debut novelist offering a unique bridge between academic analysis and creative practice. With each event, each conversation, each signature in a newly purchased book, Margaret felt herself expanding into the fullness of who she truly was, not just a retired teacher, not just a widow, not just a mother, but a writer whose voice had found its rightful place in the world. The final event of the tour was a reading at her alma mater, the small liberal arts college where she had first discovered her love of literature, where she had written secretly in notebooks while ostensibly taking class notes, where she had begun the long journey toward claiming her creative voice. As she stood at the podium in the same auditorium where she had sat as an undergraduate 4 decades earlier, Margaret felt the circle of her life completing itself in the most unexpected and beautiful way. The shy, uncertain girl who had never dared to submit to the student literary magazine had become the poised, confident woman introducing her published novel to a room full of attentive listeners. "I want to close tonight with a thought for any of you who are harboring secret dreams," she said at the end of her reading. "It took me nearly 60 years to find the courage to share my writing with the world. That might seem like a cautionary tale, don't wait as long as I did. But I prefer to see it as a testament to the idea that it is never too late to become who you were meant to be." The applause that followed was thunderous, filling the space with an affirmation so powerful that Margaret felt it physically, like sunlight on her skin after a long winter indoors. Later that night, in her hotel room, she called Jason to share the success of the final event. "I wish you could have been there," she told him. "It felt like coming full circle, reading in the same room where I sat as a student, too afraid to even join the creative writing club." "I'm sorry I missed it," Jason said. "But I've got news of my own. Claire and I are moving in together." "That's wonderful," Margaret replied, genuinely delighted. "She's lovely, Jason. I'm so happy for you both." "There's more," he continued, a smile in his voice. "I'm relocating to Portland. I'll still be working for the same company, just remotely, with some travel back to New York when necessary. We found a place about 20 minutes from your house." The news hit Margaret with unexpected force. Her son, her only child, was moving closer. Not out of obligation or worry about his aging mother, but because he wanted to. Because he was creating a life that included family connection as a priority, not an afterthought. That's the best news, she managed, her voice thick with emotion. When? Next month. We'll need some help decorating. Claire thinks my minimalist tech bro aesthetic needs softening. Margaret laughed, already imagining Sunday dinners, holiday gatherings, the casual drop-ins that geographical proximity would allow. I'd be happy to help. I'm becoming quite the expert at new beginnings. After they hung up, Margaret walked to the window of her hotel room, looking out at the campus where her literary journey had begun so many years ago. The full moon illuminated the quad where she had walked as a student, dreaming of someday writing a book but too afraid to pursue that dream openly. If she could go back and speak to that young woman, what would she say? That the path would be longer and more circuitous than she could imagine? That the destination would be worth every detour, every delay, every moment of self-doubt? That the very son who had once laughed at her writing ambitions would become her strongest advocate, her most enthusiastic supporter? Perhaps she would simply say, trust yourself. Your voice matters. The stories you carry inside you deserve to be told. The grandfather clock in her hallway at home, the one that had marked the hours of her teaching career, her marriage, her widowhood, her emergence as a writer, was far away. But Margaret could almost hear its steady ticking, counting not just the passage of time but the accumulation of courage, the gathering of strength, the ongoing becoming of a woman who had finally, gloriously stepped into the fullness of herself. The spring evening was softening into night, but for Margaret Sullivan, author, a new day was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.